Imagine the year is 260 AD. You are a Roman soldier. For weeks you have not been dying on a battlefield. You have been dying in your tent. A nameless, merciless plague is moving through the camp like a silent executioner. Fever, hemorrhage, collapse. The men around you are hollow-eyed, shaking, barely able to hold a spear. Half your century is already gone, not to Persian swords, to something you cannot even fight, but your general, the most powerful man on earth, the Emperor of Rome himself, has given the order. March, fight, win. Because beyond the crumbling walls of this city called Edessa, in the shimmering, merciless heat of the northern Mesopotamian plain, tens of thousands of Sassanid warriors are waiting, and at their head rides a man who calls himself the King of Kings, the Lord of the Aryans and non-Aryans, a conqueror who already sacked Antioch, the gleaming jewel of the Roman East, and burned it to ash. His name is Shapur I. His horsemen are armoured from head to heel, rider and horse alike encased in iron and steel, charging in formations that do not break, do not slow, do not stop. They are not cavalry. They are a wall of death on horseback, and they are coming for you. What happened next? On the dusty plains outside Edessa in the year 260 AD would echo through the halls of Rome for centuries. The emperor didn't just lose the battle. He didn't just lose the army. All 70,000 of them surrounded, slaughtered, or driven into captivity in the Mesopotamian dust. The Emperor of Rome, purple cloak, imperial eagles, the living symbol of an eternal civilization, was taken alive, captured, brought before the King of Kings. What happened to him next is still debated by historians, but it began the most humiliating captivity any Roman emperor ever endured, and that was only the beginning of his ordeal. This is not myth, this is not legend. Shapur I carved this victory into rock, literally on the sacred cliff face of Naqsh-e in Persia, where it still stands today, 2,000 years later, shouting Rome's humiliation to the sky. This is the Battle of Edessa, and in the next 90 minutes I am going to tell you the brutal, unfiltered truth of what really happened, and what happened to the most powerful man in the world after he lost everything. Stay with me. Before we dive in, if you are new to wars in history, welcome. This channel is built on one simple promise. No myths, no sanitized textbook summaries, just the raw, brutal truth of history's greatest conflicts. If that's what you're here for, hit subscribe right now and ring that bell so you never miss an episode. And drop a comment below. I want to know, what do you think is the greatest military disaster in all of human history? I read every single comment. Now, back to Rome's darkest hour. The year is 253 AD. In the marble corridors of Rome, a 60-year-old senator named Publius Licinius Valerianus is draped in the imperial purple and declared Emperor of Rome. He commands armies stretching from the mist-covered highlands of Britain to the sun-baked banks of the Euphrates. He controls the greatest concentration of military power, wealth, and organized civilization the ancient world has ever produced. By every measure known to mankind, he stands at the absolute apex of human civilization. But the throne Valerian inherits is not a seat of glory. It is a seat of fire. For nearly 2 decades before Valerian's rise, the Roman Empire has been in catastrophic free fall, a period so devastating that historians would later name it the crisis of the 3rd century. It began in 235 AD with an act that would have been unthinkable a century earlier, the murder of Emperor Severus Alexander by his own soldiers. What followed was 50 years of almost unbroken chaos. At least 26 men claiming the title of emperor between 235 and 284 AD, most of them dying violently, many within months of their accession. The army, once Rome's iron fist against the world, had become Rome's greatest internal threat. While generals murdered each other for the purple, the empire bled from every border. In the north and west, Germanic barbarian confederacies, the Alemanni, the Franks, the Goths, were tearing through frontiers that had held for centuries. Cities burned, provinces were stripped bare, hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens were marched into slavery beyond the Rhine and the Danube. The plague of Cyprian, a catastrophic epidemic that may have killed 5,000 people a day in Rome at its peak, was draining the empire of the manpower it needed to defend itself, fight its wars, and hold together the machinery of civilization. Rome was fracturing, and the wolves could smell the blood. But of all the predators circling the dying empire, none was more dangerous, more sophisticated, and more terrifyingly effective than the power that rose in the east. Because in the east, history had just turned a page. The Parthian Empire, Rome's old and familiar eastern rival, was gone. For 3 centuries, Rome and Parthia had existed in a grim but stable equilibrium. They fought, they negotiated, they even traded. They knew how to manage each other. But in 224 AD, a warrior nobleman named Ardashir I, from the ancient Persian heartland of Fars, launched a revolution. He defeated the last Parthian king in battle and declared the birth of something new, something fierce, something burning with a sense of sacred national destiny, the Sassanid Empire. Named for his ancestor Sassan and fired by the vision of restoring the ancient Achaemenid Persian glories of Cyrus the Great and Darius the Great, the Sassanids were not a new management of the old Parthian state. They were a completely different beast. And when Ardashir's son, Shapur I, inherited the throne, he inherited both the vision and the fury, and turned it into something history had never seen before. Shapur I was a military revolutionary. He reorganized the Sassanid army from the ground up, perfecting what became one of the most fearsome military forces of the ancient world, anchored by the Savaran, elite, super-heavy armoured Cataphracts cavalry where both rider and horse were encased in layered mail, scale armour, and iron plate, charging in coordinated lance formations that struck Roman infantry like an avalanche of iron. He paired this hammer with a vast array of expert archers, war elephants, and siege engineers drawn from across his empire. He was not content to hold the border. He intended to break Rome. In a series of devastating campaigns beginning in the 250s AD, Shapur drove deep into Roman territory, sacking cities, burning provinces, and smashing Roman armies that dared to stand in his way. The Roman East was on fire, and a desperate, aging emperor named Valerian marched his plague-weakened legions east to stop him. He would never return. What happened at Edessa in 260 AD was not simply the worst military defeat in the history of the Roman Empire. It was the moment the myth of Roman invincibility died forever. The moment the world learned that the eternal city could bleed, its emperor could be humiliated, and its purple dragged through the Persian dust by a foreign king. This is that story, told in full, without mercy, act by act, blow by blow. From the collapse of an empire, to the greatest battle you were never taught in school, to the most horrific fate ever suffered by a Roman emperor. This is Wars in History. To understand the catastrophe that unfolded at Edessa in 260 AD, you cannot simply start at the battle. You cannot start with the armies lining up in the Mesopotamian dust. You cannot even start with the emperor who led those armies to their doom. You have to start 25 years earlier. You have to start with a murder. The year is 235 AD. The Roman Empire at first glance appears eternal and invincible. Its borders stretch from the Atlantic coast of Spain in the west to the banks of the Euphrates River in the east. Its road network, over 50,000 miles of paved stone, connects cities from Britain to Egypt. Its legions have held the barbarian world at bay for centuries. The Mediterranean Sea, what Romans called Mare Nostrum, our sea, is a Roman lake, its trade routes feeding an empire of perhaps 60 to 70 million people. But beneath this surface of marble and order, the foundations are already cracking. The Roman system of imperial succession has never truly been solved. There is no law, no written constitution, no clear mechanism that says, when an emperor dies, this man and no other takes his place. Power, in the Roman world, ultimately comes from one source, and one source only, the army. Whoever controls the legions controls Rome, and the legions know it. Emperor Severus Alexander has held the throne since 222 AD. He is, by all accounts, a thoughtful and cautious ruler, perhaps too cautious. In 235 AD, with Germanic tribes raiding across the Rhine frontier, Alexander makes a fateful decision. Rather than crush the invaders by force, he opts for diplomacy. He pays them tribute, he negotiates, he tries to buy peace. To his soldiers, camped in the mud and cold of the German frontier, watching their emperor hand silver to the same barbarians they came to fight, this is an act of unforgivable cowardice. They kill him. A common soldier from Thrace, a massive near-giant of a man named Maximinus Thrax, a man who rose from the absolute lowest ranks of the army with no political experience, no aristocratic bloodline, no senatorial pedigree whatsoever, is dragged before the assembled legions and proclaimed Emperor of Rome. Just like that. A man who may never have even visited Rome. Emperor. This single act, the murder of Severus Alexander in 235 AD, is the moment historians mark as the beginning of what they call the crisis of the 3rd century. And it would not end for nearly 50 years. What followed the murder of Severus Alexander was, simply put, the longest sustained political collapse in Roman history. Over the next 50 years, at least 26 men would claim the title of emperor and be recognized as legitimate by the Roman Senate. Dozens more, the so-called Gallic emperors, rebel generals, regional warlords, desperate usurpers, also seized the purple in various corners of the empire, ruling for months or weeks before being cut down. The total number of men who claimed the imperial title in some form during this period exceeds 50. Nearly all of them died violently, not from barbarian swords, not from Persian arrows. Most were killed by their own soldiers, by their own generals, by the very men who had elevated them to power. The army had learned a terrible lesson in 235 AD. They could make an emperor, and so they could also unmake one. The moment a soldier-emperor lost a battle, or failed to pay a promised bonus, or simply fell out of favour with the men in his camp, his life was measured in hours. Think about what this means in practice. In the year 238 AD alone, just 3 years after Maximinus Thrax was acclaimed, Rome went through 6 different emperors. 6 in a single year. Each one elevated, each one killed. Gordian I and Gordian II, father and son, held out for 22 days before their forces were crushed and both died. The Senate, in a panic, elected 2 of their own, the elderly aristocrats Pupienus and Balbinus, as joint emperors. They lasted 99 days before the Praetorian Guard hauled them from the palace, tortured them, and dragged their bodies through the streets of Rome. Their replacement, the 13-year-old boy Gordian III, survived longer, but was dead by 244 AD, killed on campaign against the Persians, possibly murdered by his own officers. This is the world Valerian is born into. This is the world he will one day rule. The psychological effect on Roman society was devastating. The emperor had always been more than a man. He was a symbol, the living embodiment of Roman power, Roman stability, Roman eternity. Romans genuinely believed their city had been destined by the gods for eternal rule. Roma Eterna, eternal Rome. It was not mere propaganda, it was a sincere, deeply held belief. And now the symbol was being murdered every few months. The political chaos did not exist in a vacuum. It fed directly into an economic catastrophe that touched every Roman, from the wealthiest senator in his marble villa to the poorest farmer scratching a living from the Italian soil. The problem was money, or more precisely, the lack of it. Roman imperial finances had always relied on a delicate balance. Revenue from conquered territories, taxation of the provinces, the spoils of war. All of this fed the treasury that paid the army, built the roads, maintained the grain supply for Rome's urban masses, and funded the vast bureaucratic machine that kept civilization running. But that system depended on stability and expansion. A growing empire generates income. A shrinking, embattled empire does not. By the 250s AD, the empire was not growing. It was hemorrhaging. Every new usurper needed to pay his troops a massive accession bonus to secure their loyalty, what Romans called a donativum. Every general who raised a rebellion needed silver to recruit and arm his men. And the fastest way to get silver when the treasury is running dry is to do exactly what every desperate government throughout history has done: debase the currency. The Roman silver denarius, the empire's standard coin, used for 300 years, began to be quietly, systematically corrupted. Under the Savaran emperors a generation earlier, the denarius had been roughly 50% silver, By the middle of the 3rd century, it had fallen to as little as 2 to 5% silver, mostly copper, with a thin silver wash that rubbed off in your hand. The coin looked like money. It was barely worth the metal it was stamped on. The result was hyperinflation. Prices for grain, for goods, for labour skyrocketed as the currency lost its value. Merchants refused to accept the debased coins, demanding payment in kind, in grain, in wine, in actual silver bullion instead. The vast internal trading network that had made the Roman economy the most sophisticated in the ancient world began to fracture. Cities that had thrived on commerce began to shrink. The Great Trade, routes that had carried silks from China and spices from India through Roman markets, began to dry up. For ordinary Romans, daily life became a grinding struggle for survival. Farms were abandoned, craftsmen closed their workshops. The common free people of Rome's cities, no longer able to support themselves in the urban economy, began streaming into the countryside, seeking the protection of wealthy landowners. In exchange for shelter and food, they surrendered their freedom, becoming the colony, a half-free class of tenant farmers tied to the land. Historians would look back on this arrangement centuries later and recognize it for what it was, the beginning of medieval feudalism, born from the ashes of Roman prosperity. The crisis of the 3rd century did not merely damage the Roman economy, it fundamentally, permanently transformed the economic character of Western civilization. If the barbarians were Rome's visible enemy, and economic collapse its silent one, then the plague of Cyprian was its supernatural torment, a catastrophe so vast, so terrifying, and so relentless that Romans genuinely believed the gods had abandoned them. The plague erupted around 249 AD, in the reign of Emperor Decius. Named for Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage who witnessed it firsthand and described its horrors in visceral detail, it swept through the empire from 249 to 262 AD, over a decade of continuous outbreak. Its exact pathogen remains debated by modern scholars. Candidates include smallpox, measles, a form of viral hemorrhagic fever similar to Ebola, or a combination of multiple diseases moving through a population with no immunity. Whatever it was, it killed on a staggering scale. At the height of the outbreak in Rome, ancient sources report 5,000 people dying in the city every single day. Every single day, for months and years on end. The city of Alexandria, one of the greatest metropolises of the ancient world, home to an estimated 500,000 people, saw its population fall to just 190,000, a decline of over 60%, though some of that was flight rather than death. Cyprian himself described the symptoms: uncontrollable vomiting and diarrhea, eyes inflamed with blood, feet and hands blackening with gangrene, the throat burning, the body racked with convulsions. The sick were abandoned in the streets by terrified families. Bodies piled up in houses, in roads, in the fields outside the city walls, because there were no longer enough living people to bury the dead. The stench of death hung over every major city in the empire for years. The military impact was catastrophic. The legions, already stretched thin across thousands of miles of frontier, were gutted by the plague. Entire units ceased to exist. Recruitment could not keep pace with the dying, and the men who did survive were not the same men they had been before. They were hollow-eyed, traumatized, standing guard over a civilization that seemed to be literally rotting around them. The plague also accelerated a seismic shift in Roman religious life. The old gods, Jupiter, Mars, the entire Olympian pantheon had failed. They had not protected Rome. They had not answered prayer. Into this spiritual vacuum, a new faith, one that preached hope, resurrection, and the promise of life after death for even the humblest slave, was spreading rapidly. Christianity was growing, and this too would have consequences for the empire, including consequences for Emperor Valerian himself, who would launch one of the most systematic persecutions of Christians in Roman history, even as he marched toward his own annihilation in the east. While plague rotted Rome from within, her enemies wasted no time taking advantage. In the north and west, the pressure on Rome's frontiers was unlike anything the legions had faced in centuries. The Germanic peoples beyond the Rhine and Danube, who had spent generations absorbing Roman military techniques, Roman weapons technology, and Roman tactical knowledge through trade, mercenary service, and generations of border warfare, were now organized, aggressive, and capable. The Alemanni Confederation, a powerful alliance of Germanic tribes, repeatedly burst through the Rhine frontier and plunged deep into Roman territory, reaching Italy itself on more than one occasion. Roman cities in what is now France, Germany, and Switzerland, prosperous, unfortified centres of civilization that had not needed walls for 3 centuries, suddenly found themselves in desperate need of them. Overnight, the Roman world began to wall itself in. The very act of building city walls was itself a confession of vulnerability, a statement that the eternal Pax Romana was over. The Goths, moving from the Black Sea region down through the Balkans, were perhaps even more devastating. In 251 AD, Emperor Decius, the same man in whose reign the plague of Cyprian began, led his army against a Gothic force at the Battle of Abritus in what is now Bulgaria. It was a catastrophe. The Romans were lured into a swamp, surrounded and slaughtered. Decius himself was killed, along with his son. He was the first Roman emperor to die in battle against a foreign enemy, another record broken, another symbol shattered. The Franks pushed through the Rhine and raided as far as Spain and North Africa. The Vandals swept through the Danubian provinces. The Carpi raided Dacia. Everywhere, it seemed, the barbarian world was pressing in, testing the walls, probing the gaps and finding them everywhere. And Rome was spending her strength fighting herself. But of all the threats hammering Rome's world apart during these terrible decades, none was more organised, more ideologically driven, or more militarily formidable than the power that had just been reborn in the East. For 3 centuries, Rome's eastern frontier had been defined by its relationship with the Parthian Empire. The Parthians were a fact of life, a major power certainly, but one Rome had learned to manage. They shared the same basic strategic realities. They had fought each other, made peace, drawn borders, traded, and generally arrived at a kind of armed coexistence. Rome respected Parthia. Parthia respected Rome. Neither wanted total war. Then, in 224 AD, a nobleman from the ancient Persian heartland of Fars changed everything. His name was Ardashir I, and he was the ruler of a small vassal kingdom within the Parthian Empire called Persis, the same Persis that had been the heartland of the great Achaemenid Persian Empire of Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes, the empire that had once stretched from Egypt to India and had nearly conquered Greece itself. Ardashir was not merely ambitious. He was burning with a sacred sense of historical destiny, a conviction that the ancient Persian glory that had been extinguished by Alexander the Great 5 centuries earlier needed to be restored. He rose in revolt against the last Parthian king, Artabanus IV. He defeated him in battle at the Battle of Hormozgan in 224 AD, a battle in which Artabanus was killed. He swept into the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon, and in 226 AD he held his coronation there and declared the birth of a new dynasty, the House of Sassan, the Sassanid Empire. This was not a change of management. This was a revolution. Where the Parthians had been in many ways culturally fluid and pragmatic, comfortable with Hellenistic influences, relatively tolerant in their religious policy, somewhat decentralized in their governance, the Sassanids were something fundamentally different. They were Persian nationalists in the deepest sense of the word. They promoted the ancient Persian religion of Zoroastrianism with missionary zeal, establishing a powerful priestly class, the Magi, as a pillar of their state. They claimed descent from the ancient Achaemenid kings, styling themselves the heirs of Cyrus the Great. They believed their mission was the restoration of ancient Persian greatness, and crucially, they believed that meant reclaiming all the territories that had once been Persian, including Roman Syria, including Roman Egypt, including much of what was now the Roman Near East. From the very first days of the Sassanid Empire, the new dynasty was on a collision course with Rome. Ardashir I immediately began raiding into Roman territory, probing the eastern frontier, testing Roman resolve. He captured Nisibis. He threatened Kari. He was sending a message. The old arrangements with Parthia are finished. A new power has risen. Ardashir I died in 241 AD, having already begun co-ruling with his son for the final years of his reign. The man who inherited the Sassanid throne was not simply a worthy successor to his father. He was, in the judgment of history, one of the most brilliant and fearsome rulers the ancient world ever produced. His name was Shapur I. He called himself Shahanshah, King of Kings, and unlike the dozens of desperate Roman emperors who clung to grand titles while their worlds crumbled around them, Shapur I had the military genius, the organisational brilliance, and the sheer will to make those titles mean something. From the beginning of his reign, Shapur understood something about Rome that Roman generals were reluctant to admit. The empire was in its weakest condition in centuries. The political chaos of the crisis of the 3rd century was plainly visible from the Sassanid court in Ctesiphon. Every few months, a new name arrived on the throne of Rome. Every few years, a fresh civil war drained Roman strength, pulled Roman legions away from the eastern frontier, and created windows of vulnerability that a sufficiently bold and prepared enemy could exploit. Shapur I intended to exploit every single one of them. He spent the first years of his reign not in reckless invasion, but in patient, systematic preparation. He reorganized the Sassanid military from the ground up. He built an army unlike anything Rome had faced before. A multi-layered force of devastating complementary arms, anchored at its core by the legendary Savaran, the elite super-heavy Cataphracts cavalry of the Sassanid Empire, both horse and rider encased in layered iron, scale armour, chainmail, reinforced plate, wielding long lances designed to punch through the shields and armour of the Roman infantry at a full charge. A wall of iron-clad horseflesh bearing down on Roman legions who had never encountered anything quite like it. Supporting the Savaran were vast formations of devastating composite bowmen, expert siege engineers drawn from across the empire, and in some campaigns terrifying formations of war elephants, creatures that Roman horses would not approach, that smashed through infantry lines like living battering rams. By the time Shapur I was ready to turn his full attention westward against Rome, he had built a military machine that was arguably the most sophisticated in the world. He was not content to raid the border, he was coming for the empire itself. And in the 250s AD, just as Emperor Valerian was trying to hold together a Roman world fracturing from within, Shapur I unleashed his machine upon the Roman East. The results were catastrophic. By the time we reach the early 250s AD, the picture is almost incomprehensible in its darkness. The Roman Empire, master of the Mediterranean world, builder of roads and aqueducts and the greatest city civilization had ever seen, is simultaneously tearing itself apart in relentless civil war, with generals murdering emperors and proclaiming themselves rulers every few months. Hemorrhaging economically, its currency nearly worthless, its trade networks broken, its cities beginning to wall themselves in against their own citizens, dying in the millions from a plague that has no cure and no mercy, killing 5,000 people a day in Rome itself, being invaded on every frontier simultaneously, Alemannian Franks in the Rhine, Goths in the Balkans and Danube, a resurgent and ferociously ambitious Sassanid Empire in the east. And yet, Rome does not fall, not yet. Because scattered among the chaos are men of iron who refuse to let it fall, men who seize the purple in desperate circumstances and fight with everything they have to hold the empire together, knowing they will probably die for it and marching forward anyway. One of these men is an elderly senator named Publius Licinius Valerianus. In 253 AD, at approximately 60 years of age, ancient by the standards of his violent era, Valerian is proclaimed Emperor of Rome by the legions of Rhaetia after the sitting Emperor Trebonianus Gallus is murdered by his own men. He rides to Rome. The Senate acknowledges him. His son Gallienus is made co-emperor, tasked with holding the west while the father turns east to face the Persian threat. Valerian is not a military genius. He's not a young, fire-blooded conqueror. He is an aristocrat, a man of the old senatorial tradition, a man who believes in the dignity and permanence of Roman civilization with the bone-deep conviction of his class and his upbringing. He is also, in 253 AD, inheriting the most dangerous throne in the world, in the most dangerous moment in Roman history. And somewhere beyond the eastern horizon, Shapur I, the King of Kings, is already sharpening his weapons. In Act 2 we go east. We watch Shapur's war machine in motion, the devastation of Roman Syria, the sacking and burning of the magnificent city of Antioch, the terror of the Sassanid Cataphracts cavalry thundering across the Roman Near East. We watch the East burn. The Persian juggernaut is coming. Before we watch Rome's emperor fall, we have to watch Rome bleed. Not once, not twice, but in 3 cascading waves of Persian military fury, each one bolder and more devastating than the last. Because Shapur I did not simply stumble into a confrontation with Valerian, he engineered it. He spent 2 decades systematically dismantling Rome's eastern defences, studying Roman weaknesses, breaking Roman armies, humiliating Roman emperors, and tightening the noose around the Roman East until there was nowhere left to run. The story of Edessa begins not in 260 AD, but in 240 AD, when a young co-king of the Sassanid Empire first pointed his spear westward and decided that Rome had dominated the Near East long enough. When Shapur I was crowned co-regent alongside his father, Ardashir I, in April of 240 AD, he was not an untested prince stepping gingerly into power. He was already a seasoned warrior hardened by years of brutal campaigning at his father's side. He had stood at the siege of Hatra, the great virtually impregnable desert fortress city of eastern Mesopotamia that had defied the Emperor Trajan himself, that had laughed at 2 sieges by the mighty Septimius Severus. Archaeologists excavating the Hatra site have uncovered the most extensive siege works ever recorded in the ancient Near East. A circumvallation circuit, an enormous 184-hectare siege camp, a 101-hectare outer perimeter, with 25 kilometres of walls and ditches. Shapur took the city that the Roman Empire could not. He sacked it, exterminated the surrounding tribes, and left it a ghost town. This is who Shapur I was before he ever turned his gaze westward toward Rome, a man who solved siege problems that had stumped the greatest Roman generals of the previous century, who built military infrastructure on a scale that dwarfed the Romans' own legendary engineering, and who believed, with the total conviction of a man who has never yet been permanently stopped, that the ancient Persian Empire needed to be restored to its full Achaemenid grandeur, and that meant taking back what Persia had lost. Shapur organised his military apparatus with genius. At its apex sat the Savaran, the elite armoured cavalry that formed the hammer of the Sassanid war machine. The word itself means roughly horsemen in Middle Persian, but to call them simply horsemen is to call a war elephant simply an animal. These were the most heavily armoured cavalry in the ancient world, arguably in all of human history up to that point. Their equipment, as recorded in detail from Sassanid sources and confirmed by archaeological finds, was staggering. Helmet, hauberk, breastplate, layered mail, gauntlet armour covering the hands and wrists, thigh guards, full horse armour. The zenobzar, complete iron barding covering the horse from head to flank. They carried the arsht, the heavy cavalry lance with a sword-like blade at its tip, couched under the arm for maximum impact, driven by the full momentum of an armoured warhorse at the charge. They also carried a bow, a quiver of 30 arrows, a sword and a mace, a warrior capable of devastating enemies at range and then closing to crush them in close combat. The sight of a Savaran charge, hundreds, sometimes thousands of iron-encased horsemen riding in coordinated formation, lances levelled, the thunder of their horses shaking the earth, was, by every ancient account, something that shattered the nerve of the soldiers who had never faced it before. Even Roman soldiers, the hardest men in the ancient world, veterans of the Rhine and Danube frontiers, reported being unable to look directly at the glare of the Sassanid armour reflecting the Syrian sun. Shapur paired his Savaran with vast formations of mobile horse archers, Parthian-style bowmen who could saturate an enemy formation with arrows from horseback at full gallop, turning away before contact and reforming to strike again, a tactic Romans had suffered under it. Kari, 3 centuries earlier, and still had no reliable answer for. He added regiments of war elephants, towering, terrifying creatures that Roman cavalry horses simply refused to approach, who smashed through infantry formations like living siege engines. And he brought with him the finest siege engineers in the world, men who had already demonstrated at Hatra and would demonstrate again at Dura Europos that no Roman fortification was beyond their ability to breach. This was not an army built for raiding and plunder, though it plundered magnificently. This was an army built for conquest. In 242 AD, the teenage Roman Emperor Gordian III marched east with a massive, well-equipped army and an experienced general at his side. his father-in-law and Praetorian prefect Timesitheus. It was one of the most capable Roman forces assembled in years, and initially it performed brilliantly. Timesitheus drove the Sassanid forces back, recaptured the key cities of Carrhae and Nisibis, and crushed a Persian army at the Battle of Ressaina, forcing Shapur to retreat and restore Roman territory. Gordian III wrote triumphantly to the Senate, "We have penetrated as far as Nisibis, and shall even get to Ctesiphon." He would never reach Ctesiphon. Timesitheus died, of dysentery, the ancient sources say, and with him died the campaign's military direction. Gordian, barely 20 years old and now without his experienced commander, continued east toward the Sassanid heartland. Shapur, patient and calculating, had used the pause to reorganize. At the Battle of Mesech in 244 AD, near the Euphrates, deep in Mesopotamia, Shapur met Gordian's army and crushed it. The exact details of Gordian's death remain debated by historians. Some ancient sources say he was killed in the battle itself, others that he died of wounds or was subsequently murdered by his own officers in the chaotic aftermath. What is certain is that he died, the Roman emperor, dead on Persian soil. Shapur was so proud of this victory that he renamed the site of the battle Peros Shapur, Victorious Shapur. He then turned his attention to the desperate Roman army trapped in Mesopotamia, far from home, leaderless, surrounded, and entirely at his mercy. The new emperor they elevated in a panic, Philip the Arab, had no good options. He needed to get his army home. He needed to do it quickly, and he needed Shapur's permission. What followed was described by Roman sources themselves as a most shameful treaty. Philip agreed to pay Shapur an immediate ransom of 500,000 gold denarii, an almost incomprehensible sum. He agreed to pay an annual tribute. He surrendered Roman claims to the Kingdom of Armenia, acknowledging it as falling within the Persian sphere of influence, and he agreed to abandon territory between Singara and the Tigris. Shapur let the Romans go home. Alive, yes, but broken, diminished, bled dry, and forced to commemorate their own. Humiliation on coins that advertised Pax Fundata Compersis. Peace established with the Persians. It was not peace, it was a bill of submission, stamped in Roman gold. Shapur commemorated the victory on his rock reliefs in Pars. Rome had barely survived its first encounter with the Sassanid juggernaut. For several years, Shapur turned his attention elsewhere, east to the vast Kushan territories stretching toward the Indian subcontinent, where his armies eventually pushed deep into Bactria, Afghanistan, and the lands around Peshawar. He was building an empire on two fronts simultaneously, something that should have been impossible for a single man to manage. He did it anyway, but Rome could not stay quiet. Philip broke the treaty. He seized lost territory. He sheltered Rome's allies in Armenia against Sassanid pressure. And when Philip was murdered by his own soldiers and replaced by Decius in 249 AD, the Sassanid-Roman relationship collapsed entirely. In 252 AD, Shapur launched his second Roman campaign, and this time he was done with the frontier fortresses of Upper Mesopotamia. He had learned from his first campaign. He had watched the Roman defensive system carefully. He understood that the Roman network of border fortifications in Mesopotamia was designed to bleed an invading army through a slow, grinding series of sieges. Each fortress had to be taken individually, and while you were reducing one, Roman forces could regroup behind the others, so Shapur simply went around them. He marched his army up the Euphrates and swept deep into Syria, outflanking the entire Roman Mesopotamian defensive line in one bold strategic stroke. And in 252 AD, a Roman army tried to stop him. It failed catastrophically. At the Battle of Barbalissos, fought on the Euphrates in Roman Syria, Shapur's forces annihilated a Roman army that his own inscription records as 60,000 strong, 60,000 Roman soldiers wiped out. Shapur recorded the victory, himself on the Kabaye Zartosht inscription at Naqsh-e Rostam. He destroyed this army in a single battle, and then burned and ravaged the Roman province of Syria and all its dependencies. And now the road to Antioch was open. Antioch. Let that name sit for a moment. In the middle of the 3rd century AD, Antioch on the Orontes, in what is now the province of Hatay in southern Turkey, was one of the 3 greatest cities in the Roman world, rivaled only by Rome and Alexandria. It was Rome's eastern capital in all but name, a gleaming metropolis of perhaps 500,000 inhabitants, the headquarters of the Eastern legions, the richest trading city in the Roman Near East, a place of magnificent temples, vast colonnaded streets, bathhouses, theatres, and libraries. Antioch was the crown jewel of Roman Asia, the city that the empire could not afford to lose. In 256 AD, Shapur's forces reached its walls. The manner of its fall is preserved in ancient sources with vivid, almost surreal detail. The inhabitants were caught entirely off guard. Many of them were outside the city walls, gathered at a theatre production, enjoying a performance, distracted, relaxed. The distant war something happening to other people in other places. Assisted by a local collaborator named Meredes, a Roman exile who had been outlawed from Antioch and now guided the Persian forces, Shapur's army fell upon the city before a proper defence could be organised. The citadel was breached with a giant battering ram. The city fell. What happened next was, by every ancient account, devastating. Shapur's forces sacked Antioch. Its population was not massacred wholesale. Shapur had more calculated intentions for them. He deported them. The citizens of Antioch, artisans, architects, craftsmen, scholars, engineers, ordinary families, were marched east into Persia, where Shapur was constructing a new city in Khuzestan. He named it Weh Antioch Shapur, Shapur's better, Antioch. The message could not have been more deliberate or more insulting. The Persians had not just destroyed Rome's greatest eastern city, they had taken it home with them. They had reproduced it on Persian soil, staffed it with Roman citizens, and named it Better Antioch. A trophy city, built from the living population of Rome's own crown jewel. Shapur did not stop at Antioch. He swept through Syria and Cappadocia like a fire through dry grass. His own inscription records the list of cities sacked in this campaign, with the relentless accumulation of a conqueror keeping score: Hierapolis, Beroea, Apamea, Larissa, Seleucia, Alexandretta, Dolicia, Germanicea, 37 towns and cities in total, stripped, burned, or depopulated. A second Sassanid force simultaneously raided the Satala region deep in Roman Armenia. The Roman East was not merely burning, it was being systematically dismantled. Shapur's second campaign did not end with fire and plunder. It ended with one of the most technically sophisticated acts of military engineering in the ancient world, an act that was not fully understood until modern archaeologists literally dug up its evidence in the 20th century. After the blitz through Syria, Shapur turned his attention to the heavily fortified Roman frontier city of Dura Europos on the Euphrates, a key Roman strongpoint that had been recaptured from him after his first campaign. He was determined to take it permanently. In 256 AD, Shapur committed massive siege works to reduce the fortress. Archaeological excavations at Dura Europos have revealed 3 separate Sassanid siege camps whose areas, 117 hectares, 121 hectares, and 124 hectares, were individually larger than standard Roman legionary camps. This was a siege conducted on a scale that dwarfed anything Roman military doctrine typically deployed. But it was what happened underground that truly revealed Shapur's military genius. The Sassanid engineers dug extensive tunnels beneath the city walls, attempting to collapse them from below, while Roman soldiers dug countermines to intercept them. In 2009, archaeologist Simon James published a landmark study of the physical evidence found in one of those tunnels, evidence that revealed something horrifying. The Persian forces had used a chemical weapon. They ignited a concoction of sulfur crystals and bitumen pitch inside the tunnel, creating a cloud of toxic, suffocating gas, sulfur dioxide, that rolled through the confined underground space and asphyxiated the Roman soldiers defending the countermine. 20 Roman soldiers and 1 Persian officer were found exactly where they died. Their remains still in the tunnel, preserved for 17 centuries. The Romans inside Dura Europos were being gassed underground while the walls above them shook from Persian siege rams. The city fell. Both sides abandoned it afterward. Dura Europos was never inhabited again, its ruins sealed under desert. Sands preserved the evidence of what happened there until modern archaeologists uncovered them, including the chemical weapon that killed those 20 Roman defenders in the dark. This was the enemy Rome was facing, not a barbarian horde, not a disorganized frontier people with axes and animal skins. This was a sophisticated, technologically innovative, strategically brilliant military power that could outflank Roman defences, besiege Roman cities with engineering that surpassed Rome's own, and wage underground chemical warfare. And they were not done. Between his second and third Roman campaigns, Shapur continued methodically eliminating every strategic advantage Rome possessed in the east. He conquered Armenia, the mountainous kingdom that served as a critical buffer state between the two empires, and whose Sassanid royal family had historically maintained at least nominal Roman patronage. Shapur had the Armenian king Khosrow II murdered, installed his own son Hormizd I as great king of Armenia, and received the submission of Georgia. Rome's northern flank in the east, the mountainous barrier that had always provided strategic depth against Persian invasion, was gone. With Armenia in Persian hands, Shapur now controlled the high ground from which both Syria and eastern Anatolia could be threatened simultaneously. He had turned Rome's geographic buffer into a Persian launching pad. Emperor Valerian, struggling in the west with Goth invasions and plague outbreaks, had dispatched forces east and managed by 257 AD to recapture Antioch and restore some stability to the Syrian provinces. It was a temporary reprieve at best. Shapur had not truly been driven out. He had chosen to withdraw, satisfied with his plunder, his deportees, and his strategic gains. He was already planning his third and most devastating campaign. In 259 AD, Shapur moved again. He struck into northern Mesopotamia with renewed fury, recapturing Nisibis and the critically important fortress of Carrhae, the same Carrhae where, 3 centuries earlier in 53 BC, the Parthians had annihilated the Roman army of Marcus Crassus, killing him and destroying 7 legions in the worst defeat Roman arms had suffered before Hannibal. The name Carrhae alone was a byword for Roman catastrophe. And now it was in Persian hands again. From Carrhae, Shapur pushed further west and placed Edessa itself under siege. Edessa, a mid-sized but strategically vital city in the province of Osrhoen, what is now the city of Urfa in southeastern Turkey, sitting at the crossroads of the roads between Mesopotamia, Syria, and Anatolia. Edessa was not merely a city. It was the lock on the door between Persia and the whole Roman East. Take Edessa, and the road to Antioch, to the Aegean coast, to Asia Minor itself lay open. Shapur was not in a hurry. He settled his forces around Edessa's walls and waited. He knew what was coming. He knew that the Roman emperor himself, Valerian, the last great hope of a fracturing empire, would have no choice but to march east and fight. Edessa could not be allowed to fall. The political consequences alone would be catastrophic. Another Roman emperor who stood by while Persia sacked the east would not survive the outrage of his army. Valerian had to come. He had to fight. Shapur was counting on it. Since the days of the young warrior prince at the siege of Hatra, across 2 decades of patient, calculated warfare, Shapur I had been preparing for exactly this moment. 3 Roman emperors had now felt the weight of his campaigns. Gordian III dead at Mesech, Philip humiliated into paying tribute, and now Valerian being dragged east like a fish on a hook. One after another, in a sequence of military campaigns that had no parallel in the history of Rome's eastern wars, Shapur had stripped away Rome's fortresses, broken its armies, devastated its greatest cities, eliminated its buffer states, and isolated its last stronghold in the east. The trap was set. The army of Persia, encamped in the dust outside Edessa's walls, waited for the Emperor of Rome to walk into it. He would not disappoint them. In Act 3, we follow Valerian's march into the east, the massive army he assembles, the desperate stakes of the campaign, and the invisible enemy that strikes his men down before a single Persian arrow is loosed. Because the Sassanid cavalry was not the first thing that began killing the legions of Rome. The plague got there first. By the year 253 AD, the Roman Empire is a wounded giant, still enormous, still formidable in isolated moments, still capable of extraordinary feats of arms when conditions are right. But the wounds are deep, the blood loss is severe, and the vital systems that once made the empire function with clockwork precision are failing one by one. Into this collapsing world, an elderly senator climbs onto the most dangerous throne on earth and makes a vow, silent or spoken we cannot know, to hold the line. His name, as we have established, is Publius Licinius Valerianus, Emperor Valerian. And in the 7 years between his accession in 253 AD and the catastrophe of Edessa in 260 AD, he will fight constantly, on multiple fronts simultaneously, against enemies that multiply faster than he can defeat them. He will make difficult decisions, controversial decisions, even morally indefensible decisions. He will win genuine victories. He will claw back lost territory with stubborn determination. But at every step, history is closing the trap around him, a trap set with infinite patience by a Persian king who has been watching Rome's agony from across the Euphrates and calculating exactly when and exactly how to strike the killing blow. To understand why Valerian marched his army into the killing ground outside Edessa, we need to understand the man himself and the desperate strategic logic that gave him no other choice. Publius Licinius. Valerianus was born around 199 AD, the early years of the Savaran dynasty, when the empire still functioned with relative coherence, and a man of aristocratic birth could still reasonably expect his life to unfold along the traditional Roman path of offices, honours, and dignified public service. He was, unlike virtually every other emperor of the crisis of the 3rd century, a man of impeccably old Roman stock, not a provincial soldier elevated by his troops' swords, not a barbarian general who had clawed his way up, through the ranks, not a desperate teenager propped up by an ambitious relative. Valerian was old Roman aristocracy, senatorial class, deeply steeped in the traditions and values of the Republic and the early empire, a man who had served as consul, as censor under Emperor Decius, and as trusted administrator to multiple emperors. He believed in the Senate, he believed in Roman law and Roman tradition, he believed, genuinely and deeply, in the eternal destiny of Rome. In 238 AD, he had been the princeps senatus, the leading senator, the first man of the Senate house. When Gordian I had needed the Senate's backing for his imperial claim, he had negotiated through Valerian. When Decius had revived the ancient Roman office of censor, with authority that rivaled the emperor himself, he had offered the post to Valerian, who declined it with characteristic old Roman modesty. When Trebonianus Gallus needed a reliable commander to raise and march an army, he turned to Valerian. By the time Valerian became emperor himself in 253 AD, he was roughly 60 years old. In an era when most men who reached for the purple were cut down within months, this man had survived through ability, reputation, and what might be called a gift for being indispensable without being threatening. He was the kind of Roman that the old Rome had produced in abundance, and the new Rome of the crisis had nearly stopped producing altogether. Principled, experienced, steady, and profoundly committed to the idea of the empire as a civilizational mission, rather than merely a vehicle for personal power. He was also, unmistakably, a man of his era's blind spots. His persecution of Christians, launched in 257 AD and escalating dramatically in 258 AD, was brutal and systematic, targeting not just ordinary believers, but specifically the leadership and financial infrastructure of the Church. Bishop Cyprian of Carthage, the same man whose name is attached to the plague, was among those executed on Valerian's orders in 258 AD. The Christian writer Lactantius, composing his accounts decades later, would make sure that history remembered Valerian's persecution when it recorded his fate. The man who flayed the Church would himself, the Christians believed, be flayed by God's own judgment. But in the political and military world of 253 AD, these were future considerations. In 253 AD, Valerian's first and most pressing task was simply to stop the empire from disintegrating entirely. Valerian's first act as emperor was pragmatic and logical. He divided the empire. His son Gallienus, also named Publius Licinius, Egnatius Gallienus, a man of comparable intelligence and considerably more military agility than his father, was elevated to co-emperor and given responsibility for the West. The Rhine, the Danube, the Gallic provinces, the endless barbarian pressure from the Germanic world, Gallienus would handle all of it. Valerian himself took the East, the Persian threat, the Syrian provinces, the burning border along the Euphrates. It was a sensible arrangement. The empire was simply too large, the threats too numerous and geographically dispersed for one man to manage. In theory, father and son commanding in two theatres simultaneously was the rational solution to an irrational problem. In practice, it meant that when one theatre went catastrophically wrong, the other could send no help. In the east, Valerian's first years produced real results. By 257 AD, he had recaptured Antioch, the great city that Shapur had sacked in 256 AD, and restored Roman authority in the Syrian provinces. He reorganized the eastern legions, shored up the frontier defences, replenished supplies, and restored something approaching normal Roman administrative function to the badly disrupted eastern provinces. After the humiliations of Shapur's second campaign, it was a genuine recovery. Roman commanders in the east were fighting back, and fighting effectively. But the recovery was fragile and the threats were relentless. In 258 AD, a massive Gothic and Herulian naval raiding force swept across the Black Sea, landed on the coast of Anatolia, and devastated the coastal cities of Pontus and Bithynia, deep in Roman territory, nowhere near the Persian frontier. Cities like Trapezus were sacked by sea-borne barbarians who had never been expected to reach them. The shock was profound. Valerian himself was forced to take his eastern army north and west to Anatolia to deal with the raiders, pulling forces away from the Euphrates frontier at precisely the moment Shapur was watching and calculating. He attempted to intercept the Gothic raiders at Antioch, but the plague struck his army while it was assembled there, killing men before any battle was fought. He was unable to bring the Goths to a decisive engagement. The Goths raided as far as Cappadocia before eventually withdrawing. The Eastern army, weakened and plague-struck, had achieved nothing. And in 259 AD, with the Eastern legions still recovering from the plague outbreak in Anatolia, Shapur made his move. In 259 AD, some modern scholars date the final Sassanid offensive to early 260 AD, but the build-up and initial moves were underway in 259. Shapur launched his third Roman campaign. His intelligence network, built up over decades of patient watching, told him everything he needed to know. The Eastern Roman army was plague-weakened. Gallienus was pinned in the west, fighting simultaneously on the Rhine and in Pannonia, and unable to send reinforcements east. Valerian was stretched thin, moving between theatres, reacting rather than acting. The moment Shapur had spent a lifetime building toward had finally arrived. He struck into northern Mesopotamia with overwhelming force. He recaptured the key fortress cities of Carrhae and Nisibis, the twin anchors of Rome's Mesopotamian defensive line, in rapid succession. With both cities in Persian, Hands, the defensive system that Rome had maintained along the upper Euphrates and Tigris for over a century, effectively ceased to exist. The road to Syria was open. Then he swung west toward Edessa. The siege of Edessa placed Valerian in a position of impossible strategic constraint. Edessa was not simply a city. It was a symbol, a lifeline, a keystone. It sat at the junction of the roads connecting Mesopotamia, Syria, and Anatolia. Let it fall, and the entire Roman East was exposed to Persian penetration as far west as the Aegean coast. More than that, let a Roman emperor stand inactive while the Persians besieged a major Roman city in his own military theatre, with his own army present in the east, and that emperor would not survive the political fallout. The soldiers would not forgive it. The Senate would not forgive it. History would not forgive it. Valerian had no choice but to march to Edessa and fight. This is exactly what Shapur was counting on. In 259 to 260 AD, Valerian assembled what would be one of the largest Roman armies gathered in the East in a generation. Ancient sources and modern historical scholarship, drawing on Shapur I's own inscription at Kabba Yazartosht, estimate the Roman force at approximately 70,000 men. This was not an army scraped together from the dregs of available manpower. Shapur's own inscription, the most reliable contemporary record we have, specifically notes that Valerian's army was composed of men drawn from nearly every corner of the Roman Empire and included Germanic allies. It listed contingents from the provinces of Germany, Raetia, Noricum, Dacia, Pannonia, Moesia, Istria, Spain, Morocco, Thrace, Bithynia, Asia, Pamphylia, Isauria, Lycaonia, Galatia, Lycia, Cilicia, Cappadocia, Phrygia, Syria, Phoenicia, Judea, Arabia, Mauritania, Germanic tribes, and others. It was, on paper, a pan-imperial force, the might of the whole Roman world concentrated into one fist, aimed at the Persian threat. In theory, 70,000 men was a force large enough to have crushed almost any enemy on the planet in 260 AD. In practice, it was something else entirely. The plague had been inside Valerian's camps before the army ever left Anatolia. It had struck the army at Antioch in 258 AD, as the massive force assembled and began its march eastward through the brutal Syrian and Mesopotamian summer heat, through Antioch, along the Euphrates corridor toward the dust and flies and water shortage of the northern Mesopotamian frontier. The plague marched with it, invisible, unstoppable, utterly indifferent to the rank of its victims. It did not care that you were a Roman legionary with a century of military tradition behind you. It did not care that your emperor needed you to fight. It killed soldiers in their bedrolls, in their marching formations, in their camp latrines, at their cooking fires, in the arms of their tent mates who would themselves be dead within days. The historian Peter the Patrician, writing in the 6th century AD but drawing on the earlier account of the Greek historian Dexippus, who was a near contemporary of the events, records explicitly that a plague broke out among Valerian soldiers in spring of 260 AD as they were fighting the Sassanids, and that the contingent from Mauritania was particularly devastated by it. The disease tore through the army with such ferocity that even historians who are otherwise sceptical about ancient casualty figures agree that the Roman force that actually arrived in the area between Cavalry and Edessa in the spring of 260 AD bore no meaningful resemblance, in fighting capacity, to the 70,000 men that had been assembled and described in Shapur's inscription. An army marches on its feet. Sick men do not march well. An army fights with its mind as well as its body. Demoralized, exhausted, plague-terrified soldiers do not fight with the disciplined cohesion that Roman infantry tactics demanded. The Roman legionary system, built on the idea of trained men working together in coordinated formations, maintaining unit cohesion under pressure, executing complex maneuvers on command, required men who were physically capable and mentally present. The plague of Cyprian was stripping both of those qualities from Valerian's army with every mile they marched. Let us be brutally specific about what the plague of Cyprian was doing to Valerian's men as they camped outside Edessa in the spring of 260 AD. The symptoms, the continuous dysentery, the throat burning like fire, the bloody eyes, the feet and hands blackening with gangrene, the convulsions, were those we described in detail in Act 1, drawing on Cyprian's own De Mortalitate. We do not need to repeat them here. Now imagine this in a Roman military camp. Imagine tent lines filled with men in various stages of this process, some freshly infected and still hoping it will pass, others in the full grip of it and beyond hope. Imagine the smell, dysentery, vomit, gangrenous flesh, the copper smell of blood hemorrhaged through the eyes. Imagine the sounds, men moaning, men begging for water, men calling on gods who were not answering. Imagine the fear that moves through the healthy men like a second plague, the knowledge that the man sleeping 3 feet away from you last night is dead this morning, and you cannot tell if the ache in your own stomach is hunger or the beginning of the end. The Roman army operated on the principle of rigid organisational structure. The century, the cohort, the legion, each unit a self-contained fighting machine with its own chain of command. But plague does not respect organisational structure. It kills centurions, it kills tribunes, it kills the experienced veterans who are the institutional memory of their units, who know the formations and the commands, and how to keep frightened young soldiers steady in the line when arrows are falling and cavalry is charging. Every senior man who died of plague in Valerian's camp in the weeks before the battle took irreplaceable military knowledge with him. By the time the Roman army actually moved to engage the Sassanid forces in the spring of 260 AD, it was, in the assessment of scholars working from primary sources, only a shadow of Rome's former might. 70,000 men on paper, an unknown but clearly devastating fraction of that capable of effective fighting. The rest dead, dying, or so weakened they could barely lift their equipment. Valerian was not oblivious to the condition of his army. He knew his men were sick and dying. He knew the supply lines stretching back through Mesopotamia were under constant pressure from Sassanid raiding forces. He knew his forces were weakened, and that the army assembled around Shapur's banner was formidable, and in full fighting condition. According to the ancient source Zosimus, and corroborated by the account preserved by the 6th century historian Petrus Patricius drawing on Dexippus, Valerian at some point in the spring of 260 AD attempted to open negotiations with Shapur. To seek a diplomatic solution to the military crisis, his plague-ravaged army was no longer capable of resolving by force. He sought talks, he sent envoys, he attempted to buy, with gold and diplomatic concession, what his exhausted soldiers could no longer win by the sword. Shapur, according to these accounts, summoned Valerian to a personal meeting to discuss terms. What happened at that meeting is the pivot point of one of the most debated questions in late Roman and Sassanid history. The ancient sources disagree violently on the details. Roman and Western sources, Zosimus, Eutropius, Aurelius. Victor, the compiler of the Historia Augusta, describe a Persian act of treachery. The parley violated, the emperor seized, the whole event an ambush disguised as diplomacy. Some describe a battle first, with Valerian captured in its chaotic aftermath. Some describe the capture as the direct result of the parley itself. Shapur I's own account, carved in 3 languages, Middle Persian, Parthian and Greek, on the Kaaba-ye Zartosht at Naqsh-e Rostam, presents a different picture entirely. In Shapur's telling, there was no treachery, no violation of diplomatic norms. He simply defeated Valerian's army in battle between Cavalry and Edessa, and Valerian was captured along with the remnant of his forces. No ambush, no broken parley, a straight military defeat. Modern scholarship, including the work of Ian Hughes, published in 2023, tends toward a nuanced middle ground. The Roman army suffered catastrophic losses in the actual battle, and the rest were forced to surrender after the survivors retreated to Edessa and found themselves completely surrounded and cut off. Valerian, trapped in Edessa with the remnants of a broken army and no hope of relief from the west, was captured, whether in battle or in the negotiations that followed, the military defeat, or in some combination of both. The exact mechanism of the capture matters less than the fact itself. The Roman emperor, in the spring of 260 AD, probably in late April or May or June, under the blazing Syrian sun, somewhere between the cursed fields of Carrhae and the walls of Edessa, fell into Persian hands, alive. There is a final, deeply human dimension to this catastrophe that history deserves to acknowledge. Valerian did not have to be at Edessa. He was approximately 60 years old. He was not a young man's emperor seeking glory through personal battlefield valour. He was an aristocrat, a politician, a man who understood that the emperor's role was to command and administer, not necessarily to stand in the front rank with a sword. He could have delegated the Eastern campaign to a subordinate commander, a younger, more physically resilient general who could have taken personal risks that an emperor could not afford to take. He chose not to. He came, himself. He came because the Eastern situation demanded the authority of the emperor in person, because the Eastern legions needed to see the purple cloak on the field to know they were not abandoned, because the political consequences of staying in Antioch while the East burned were as fatal as any Persian sword. He marched to Edessa because there was no one else to send, and because he believed, with the bone-deep conviction of a man who had spent his entire adult life in service to Roman tradition, that Rome's emperor did not abandon Rome's frontiers. That conviction, that stubborn old Roman sense of duty, walked him straight into the hands of Shapur I. In Act 4, we go to the battlefield. We watch it happen in real time, the encirclement, the slaughter, the collapse of the most powerful military force Rome had assembled in the East in a generation. We watch the Sassanid war machine do exactly what it was built to do, and we watch the single, world-shaking moment when a Roman emperor fell into enemy hands for the first time in recorded history. The battle begins now. Before we go to the battle itself, a 60-second pause. You have just followed the full collapse of a Roman army before it even reached the field. Plague in the camp, supply lines severed. An emperor who knew he was marching into a trap and had no choice but to march anyway. If you are the kind of person who watches 90 minutes of history because the details actually matter to you, I want to tell you about NordVPN. I use it personally when researching geo-restricted academic content, digitized archive collections, and historical documentaries locked to specific regions. One click and you can access research libraries and streaming content from the UK, the US, Europe and beyond. Over 6,000 servers across more than 100 countries, military-grade AES 256 encryption. The link is in the description below. Now, back to 260 AD, the battle begins. The plain between Carrhae and Edessa, in the late spring or early summer of 260 AD, is one of the most consequential killing grounds in the history of the ancient world. It is flat, open terrain, the kind of ground that favours mobility, that rewards speed and manoeuvre, that punishes armies slow on their feet and locked into rigid formations. The Syrian sun beats down without mercy from a white sky. The dust rises in drifting yellow clouds from the passage of tens of thousands of men and horses. The smell of an army, sweat and leather and animal dung and the acrid, unmistakable smell of sick men, hangs in the still air. Here, on this ground, the Roman Empire's eastern army of approximately 70,000 men, half of them already dying or weakened from plague, their formations thinned, their chain of command riddled with casualties, their morale barely held together by the presence of the emperor himself, marches toward a confrontation with the finest, most battle-ready military force in the ancient world. Shapur I has chosen this ground. Shapur I has built toward this moment across a lifetime of war. What follows is not simply a battle, at least in the reconstruction that best fits the available evidence. It appears to have been a masterpiece of military destruction, executed by a general who understood his enemy's weaknesses more precisely than the enemy understood them himself. Let us first understand, with precision, exactly what these two forces looked like as they drew up across from each other on the plain. The Roman army under Valerian was on paper a formidable force, that same pan-imperial assembly from nearly every province of the empire that Shapur's own Kebaye-Zartosht inscription catalogued, and that we detailed in Act 3. In theory, the concentrated might of the whole Roman world. The plague had already done catastrophic damage. Unit cohesion, the lifeblood of Roman tactical effectiveness, thus was broken in countless formations. Centurions and tribunes who had kept their centuries and cohorts drilling in proper formation, who had maintained discipline on the march, were dead or dying in their tents. Green, frightened replacements filled their places without the experience or authority to hold men steady under pressure. The army had its core strengths. Experienced legionary heavy infantry at its best, armed with the oval scutum shield, the spatha sword, heavy javelins and throwing darts, helmets of the ridge and intercaesar pattern, mail and scale cuirasses. The Roman heavy cavalry on the flanks carried long spathae and lances. There were auxiliary units, eastern levies, and allied Germanic contingents folded into the formation. But this was not the army of Augustus or Trajan or even Marcus Aurelius. This was an army of the crisis of the 3rd century, stretched, depleted, plague-eaten, and led by an aging emperor who by all accounts was himself not in robust health. Across from them, in the shimmering heat of the Syrian plain, was something very different. The Sassanid army under Shapur I numbered somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 men, smaller than the Roman force on paper, but in effective fighting power, the disparity was entirely reversed. At its core were the Savaran, that iron-clad heavy cavalry, whose full equipment and fighting doctrine we detailed in Act 2. Backed by formations of light horse archers, the most mobile soldiers on any battlefield of the ancient world, capable of shooting backwards at full gallop, the same and devastating Parthian-style mounted bowmen Shapur had already deployed to devastating effect in his earlier campaigns. Behind the cavalry, Sassanid infantry with spears, shields and bows held the line and supported the horsemen. Shapur's army was at the absolute peak of its capability, fed, healthy, motivated, led by a general who had been winning battles for 20 years, fighting on ground he had chosen and prepared, with interior lines of communication and full knowledge of the terrain. Every single advantage that Valerian had surrendered through plague, supply failure, and strategic desperation, Shapur had accumulated. The disparity in real fighting power between these two armies, as they faced each other across the dust of northern Mesopotamia, was total. It was not a clash between equals, It was an ambush in broad daylight, executed in slow motion. Military historians studying the Battle of Edessa, working primarily from Shapur's Kaaba-ye-Zartosht inscription, the accounts preserved by Zosimus, Peter the Patrician drawing on Dexippus, and the analysis of modern scholars including David Potter in his landmark work, The Roman Empire at Bay, reconstruct the battle as a multi-phase destruction. It did not begin with a massive frontal charge of Sassanid cataphracts. Shapur was too intelligent for that. A direct frontal assault, even against a weakened Roman army, carried risks. Roman heavy infantry in a tight formation, shields locked, behind field fortifications, could absorb and break even the heaviest cavalry charge if given time to brace and organize. The key to defeating Roman infantry was not to charge it frontally. The key was to deny it the ability to form up, to disrupt its cohesion, to wear down its stamina, and to maneuver into a position where the legions could be struck from multiple directions simultaneously. This is the most plausible reading of what Shapur did. The tactical outcome confirms the broad picture even where ancient sources leave the specific choreography to inference. The opening phase of the battle was a prolonged, systematic harassment by the Sassanid mobile horse archers. These formations of fast, lightly equipped cavalry rode at medium range around the Roman perimeter, close enough to shoot, far enough to stay out of effective javelin or dart range. They did not charge. They rode and they shot. Their composite bows, with high draw strength, could penetrate Roman shields and mail at ranges that made Roman throwing weapons largely ineffective. They targeted not the shields but the gaps, the faces, the knees, the throat when a man looked up, the ankles of the men in the front ranks. For the Roman legions, this phase was psychologically agonizing. Roman infantry doctrine was built around the idea of forward momentum. Close with the enemy, use your javelin volley at short range, draw your sword, and fight in the press. Against cavalry that never came close enough to sword range, against archers who circled and shot and retreated and circled again, the Roman soldier could do nothing but stand behind his shield and absorb punishment. Try to break ranks and charge the archers? They would simply ride away, reform and resume shooting from another angle. Advance as a formed body? The archers withdrew in front and the flanks were immediately threatened. Stand still, take casualties at range until cohesion broke. The heat made it worse. Men in full armour, in the Syrian summer heat, standing under sustained arrow fire, could not drink, could not rest, could not advance, could not retreat without exposing their backs to the horsemen. Every minute on that field was a minute bleeding men, bleeding morale, bleeding the organised cohesion that was the only true defence the Roman infantry possessed against what was coming next. And the sick men, the plague-weakened soldiers standing in the ranks, began to fall first. A man whose body was already fighting an internal war against the plague of Cyprian had no reserves of strength to draw on. The exertion of standing in formation under fire in summer heat in full armour was killing them where they stood. Soldiers were collapsing in the line from heat and illness before the first Sassanid Cataphracts had made contact. As the horse archers worked the Roman formation from every reachable angle, Shapur was doing something that Valerian seems to have been unable to counter. He was moving his heavy cavalry formations in a wide arc around the flanks of the Roman army. The terrain between Carrhae and Edessa offered Shapur exactly the kind of open ground that his Savaran needed. No river to anchor a flank, no high ground to break the cavalry's approach, no dense terrain to channel and slow the armoured horsemen, just flat, open plain in every direction. A cavalry commander's dream and an infantry commander's nightmare. One reconstruction, drawing on the battle's known tactical parameters as analysed by military historians, describes Valerian's tactical plan as an attempt to pin the Sassanid army against the terrain near Edessa, to force a close-quarters engagement where Roman infantry could make their discipline and armour count. If true, the plan was fatally flawed because it gave Shapur exactly the time and space he needed to move his heavy formations wide of the Roman flanks while the horse archers occupied the Roman centre's attention. The encirclement developed gradually, then suddenly. The Sassanid horse archer formations continued their harassment of the Roman front and centre. Meanwhile, the Savaran, those iron-encased heavy cavalry formations that were Shapur's killing blow, rode wide around the Roman flanks in two great horns. The Roman cavalry on the flanks, already reduced by plague and outmatched in weight, and numbers by the Sassanid horsemen, broke or was driven back. The Sassanid formation closed like a fist around the Roman army, cutting the retreat lines to Edessa, severing the supply lines from the rear, isolating the legions in the centre of a tightening ring of iron and horsemen. The Romans were surrounded, in the open, in the heat, weakened by plague, under sustained arrow fire from every direction. This was the decisive moment, when the encirclement was complete and the Roman formations, battered by hours of horse-archer harassment, flanks collapsed, retreat routes cut, men dying in the line from arrows and heat and disease, had reached the breaking point of their cohesion. Shapur, in the reconstruction most consistent with the outcome, gave the order. The Savaran charged. What a Sassanid heavy cavalry charge looked like in 260 AD is something we can reconstruct with reasonable confidence from a combination of ancient literary descriptions, the artistic representations carved into the rock reliefs at Naqsh-e and Bishapur, and the analysis of their equipment by modern military historians. The Savaran rode in close-ordered formations, not the loose individual heroics of barbarian cavalry, but coordinated blocks of hundreds or thousands of armoured riders moving in disciplined unison, their lances lowered in the couched position, the ground shaking with the combined weight of iron-clad men on iron-clad horses moving at a gallop. The noise alone, the thunder of hooves, the rattling of scale armour, the shrieking of horses at full stretch, was, by ancient accounts, enough to shatter the nerve of men who had never heard it before. Roman horses shied from war elephants. Roman men, standing exhausted and plague-weakened behind shields already bristling with Persian arrows, shied from the wall of iron bearing down on them. The Cataphracts charge struck the already disrupted Roman formations like an avalanche. A Roman legionary line in peak condition, rested, healthy, properly positioned, with pila and javelins ready, shields locked and braced, veterans in the front ranks holding steady, could absorb and break a cavalry charge. This had been demonstrated repeatedly in Roman military history. The horses would not ride into a wall of shields and points. They would stop or veer away, and the cavalry would mill chaotically in front of the line while the infantry cut them to pieces. But Valerian's army was not in peak condition. It was not rested or healthy. Many of its veterans were dead. Its formations had been disrupted by hours of arrow fire. Its flanks were gone, and the Sassanid horse archers had specifically targeted the front ranks, the men holding the line together, for hours before the charge was ordered. The charge hit formations that were already unravelling. When a Roman formation broke, when the tight interlocking shield wall collapsed and men began to run, or to cluster in small, frightened groups rather than fighting as an organised unit, it became not a battle, but a massacre. The cavalry, among running men, was supreme. Men on horseback can pursue men on foot indefinitely. The Savaran, with their iron lance tips and straight swords, moved through the broken Roman formations at will, cutting down men who could not form a defence, driving the survivors into each other in panicking clusters that grew smaller and smaller under the circling cavalry. The Sassanid horse archers, who had spent the early phase of the battle conserving their arrows and their horses' energy, now closed in on the fleeing and clustering survivors from the outside of the encirclement, shooting into the packed masses of men who could no longer retreat or disperse. Modern historian Ian Hughes's estimate of approximately 10,000 Roman dead in the battle itself reflects this phase, the direct casualties of the Cataphracts charge and the subsequent rout. But 10,000 killed in the fight was only the beginning of the Roman catastrophe, because the survivors, the men who were not immediately cut down by the charging Savaran and encircling archers, had nowhere to go. The road to Edessa was cut. The road back to Cavalry was cut. In every direction there were Persian horsemen. The only option left was to retreat into Edessa's walls and hope its garrison could hold, while some miracle of Roman politics or Persian benevolence produced a way out. The remnant of Valerian's army staggered into Edessa. They were completely surrounded, inside Edessa's walls, with the Sassanid army encamped in a complete ring around the city and no possibility of relief from the west. Gallienus was fighting for his life on the Rhine and Danube, unable and possibly unwilling to march east. Valerian faced a situation that had no military solution. His army was finished as a fighting force. The men who had survived the battle were wounded, plague-ridden, exhausted, and traumatized. The food supplies inside Edessa were finite. There was no army anywhere in the Roman world capable of marching to his relief in time. The city's walls, formidable as they were, could not stand indefinitely against the siege engineering that had taken Dura Europos and used gas weapons in its tunnels. Valerian tried the only option remaining. He sent envoys to Shapur and requested negotiations. Here the ancient sources diverge in their accounts, and this divergence itself reveals something profound about how Rome processed this catastrophe. The Roman sources, Zosimus, Eutropius, Aurelius Victor, the Historia Augusta, strain, in various ways, to explain what happened next without confronting its most humiliating implication, that the Roman emperor simply lost and then surrendered. Zosimus suggests that Shapur agreed to peace terms and then violated the agreement, seizing Valerian in an act of treachery during the parley itself. Other Roman accounts imply a battle in which Valerian was taken in the chaotic aftermath of a fighting defeat, emphasizing Persian betrayal and incompetent Roman generals rather than a straightforward military catastrophe. These accounts follow what scholars recognize as the typical Roman pattern for processing military catastrophe. Attribute it to incompetent generals and the treachery of foreigners, anything but a straight military defeat. Rome could not accept the simple truth, so it invented villains and excuses. Shapur I's own account, carved in 3 languages on the Kabaya Zartosht at Naqsh-e Rostam, the most authoritative contemporary record we possess, is brutally simple. It says, "We fought, we won. We captured Valerian with our own hands, along with the army that was with him, and we brought them into Persia. No ambush, no treachery, no incompetent generals, a battle, a defeat, a capture." The rest of the Roman army, according to Ian Hughes's analysis, then surrendered to save their lives. The soldiers trapped in Edessa laying down their weapons and accepting Persian captivity, rather than dying uselessly in a siege they could not survive. Roman soldiers, separated from the system that gave them identity and purpose, choosing life over an honourable but pointless death in a foreign city for an emperor who was already taken. The moment Valerian was brought before Shapur I as a captive, the world shifted on its axis. Not metaphorically, literally. The political, military and psychological consequences that erupted from this single event in the spring of 260 AD were so vast and so immediate that they reshaped the Roman Empire permanently and irrevocably. Consider what the capture of the emperor meant to the Roman world. The emperor was not simply a political figure. He was not, by Roman religious and constitutional understanding, merely the most powerful man in the government. He was the living embodiment of Roman destiny, the man on whom the gods had bestowed the mandate to rule the world. Roman ideology, stretching back centuries, was built on the idea of an unbroken chain of divine favour, that Rome's victories, Rome's power, Rome's very existence as the dominant civilization of the known world was the will of the gods expressed through history. The emperor was the focus of that divine will. The Roman emperor was now in Persian hands, brought before a foreign king, his army destroyed, his dignity shattered, and the myth of Roman invincibility broken before the world. The gods had not saved him. No divine intervention, no last-minute reversal, no thunderbolt from Jupiter. Just an aging man in a purple cloak, surrounded by Persian horsemen, stripped of his army, his power, and his dignity. The shockwave hit immediately. Within weeks and months of the news reaching different corners of the empire, the political structure began to crack along every fault line the crisis of the 3rd century had already been widening. In the east, Macrianus, who had control of Valerian's military treasury and had actually commanded forces in the battle, managing to escape the encirclement, proclaimed his 2 sons, Macrianus Minor and Quietus, as co-emperors, using the captured treasury to pay his soldiers. Along the Danube, 2 more usurpers, Ingenuus and Regalianus, rose in rapid succession. And in the west, the Roman governor of Lower Germany, Postumus, seized the moment to murder Gallienus's young son and heir Saturninus, and create what historians now call the Gallic Empire, a breakaway state encompassing Gaul, Britain and Spain, that would endure for 15 years. The Roman Empire began fracturing immediately. The Gallic breakaway under Postumus was a direct, immediate consequence of Valerian's capture. The Palmyrene realm under Zenobia would not formally rupture from Rome until the 200s and 70s, but its roots lay here, in the vacuum Edessa created. This was not coincidence. This was the direct consequence of Valerian's capture. Every potential usurper in every threatened province now knew, with certainty, that the purple meant nothing, that the divine mandate was a lie, that the man wearing it could be taken alive by a foreign enemy, and that the emperor had failed to hold the east, the army had been destroyed, and the throne was up for grabs, in one battle, on one plain, in one morning. Shapur I did not just defeat a Roman army, he collapsed the myth of Roman imperial authority. He did what no Germanic barbarian, no Dacian, no Parthian, no enemy in 7 centuries of Roman warfare had managed to do. He broke the story Rome told about itself. He proved that Rome could lose, its emperor could be taken captive, and the eternal city was, in the end, as mortal as everything else. The army of 70,000 men, assembled from every province of the empire, marched through the Syrian heat, eaten alive by plague, was finished. 10,000 of its men were dead on the field. The rest were captives of Shapur I, marching east into Persia in columns of despair. For the first time in Roman history, a living emperor in enemy hands. In Act 5, we follow Valerian into captivity. We examine the brutal truth of what his life became. The legends of the human footstool, the cage, the skin stuffed with straw. We look at what the ancient sources actually say, what they agree on, what remains debated, and what the rock reliefs of Naqsh-e Rostam preserve in silent permanent stone. And we ask the final question, what does it all mean? There are moments in history that are so large, so shocking, so fundamentally impossible according to everything a civilization believes about itself, that the civilization simply cannot process them honestly. It cannot look at the unvarnished fact and accept it. So it builds a story around the fact, embellishes it, reshapes it, adds layers of meaning and morality and divine judgment, until the raw, unbearable truth has been transformed into something almost bearable, something that at least makes narrative sense, even if it shreds political dignity. The Roman world's response to the capture of Valerian was exactly this. What actually happened to the Emperor of Rome after he was taken alive by Shapur I at Edessa in 260 AD is one of the most debated questions in late Roman and Sassanid history. The ancient sources are in open, violent disagreement with each other. The Persian evidence and the Roman evidence point in dramatically different directions, and the legends, the stories that have echoed through 15 centuries of historical memory and captured the imagination of everyone who has ever heard them, occupy a contested, uncertain space between documented fact and motivated propaganda. In this final act, we're going to go through every layer of this story. We're going to look at what each major source actually says, why they say it, what their biases are, and what the physical evidence, carved into rock 2,000 years ago and still standing, actually shows. We are going to separate the verifiable from the legendary, the probable from the possible, and the historically certain from the magnificently dramatic. And we are going to conclude with what the whole story means, what it meant to Rome, what it meant to Persia, and what it still means to us. The Roman historian Eutropius wrote his Breviarium, a short summary of Roman history from the founding of the city to his own day, between 364 and 378 AD, approximately a century, after the events at Edessa. He was writing for the educated Roman audience of the late Empire, men who were well aware of the Valerian catastrophe and its consequences, and his account is notable precisely for its restraint. He does not embellish, he does not dramatize, he simply states the facts as he understands them. Eutropius writes that Valerian was overthrown by Shapur king of Persia, and being soon after made prisoner, grew old in ignominious slavery among the Parthians. That is it, a captured emperor, a life of ignominious slavery. Growing old in captivity among the Persians, whom Eutropius, in the manner of Roman writers, calls Parthians, either out of old habit or deliberate rhetorical diminishment, as if the Sassanids were merely the continuation of the old, familiar, manageable Parthian enemy, rather than the terrifying new force they actually represented. But notice what Eutropius does say. Not held in honourable captivity, not treated with dignity befitting his imperial station. Ignominious slavery. The word ignominious, from the Latin ignominia, meaning disgrace, dishonour, the stripping away of public reputation, is doing enormous weight here. Eutropius is telling his Roman readers that what Valerian experienced was not the honourable captivity of a prisoner of war treated according to the customs of civilised warfare. It was degrading. It was shameful. It was the kind of captivity that destroyed not the body alone, but the dignity, the public identity, the very concept of what the man had been. That is the minimum version, the bare fact of the degradation, without specific detail. Other sources were considerably less restrained. The Byzantine historian Zosimus, writing in the late 5th and early 6th century AD, is one of our most important sources for the late Roman Empire, despite being hostile to Christianity and working from earlier sources that no longer survive in full. His account of Valerian focuses primarily on the political chaos that immediately followed the capture, the fracturing of the empire, the rise of usurpers, the breakaway Gallic Empire under Postumus, the disaster of Gallienus's inability to rescue his father. But he is explicit on the nature of Valerian's captivity. He ended his days, Zosimus states, in the capacity of a slave among the Persians. A slave, not a royal prisoner, not an honoured guest, not even a prisoner of war with the minimal dignity that status implied. A slave. The Emperor of Rome, the man whose word had commanded legions on 3 continents, reduced to the legal and social status of a slave in the household of the man who had defeated him. Zosimus preserves another critical detail, that Valerian attempted at some point during his captivity to negotiate his release. He sent envoys to Shapur offering a massive ransom, enormous quantities of gold and silver, terms of political concession, whatever it would take to buy his way out of captivity and return to Rome. Shapur's response, according to this account, was contemptuous. He sent the envoys away. Valerian was not for sale. His value to Shapur was not financial. It was symbolic, political, and endlessly renewable. A living emperor of Rome held in Persian captivity was worth more than any ransom Rome could put together. His continued captivity was itself a daily statement about the nature of Persian power and Roman weakness. This detail, whether strictly accurate or not, rings psychologically true. Shapur had spent 2 decades building this moment. A Roman emperor held as a captive was the ultimate advertisement of Sassanid supremacy, visible to every king, every border chief, every restless province, and would-be rebel from the Euphrates to the Rhine. Why would you trade that for gold? A late antique work known as the Epitome de Caesaribus, preserved under the name of Aurelius Victor, though modern scholars debate whether Victor himself was its author, and the authorship question remains unresolved, adds a specific and horrifying detail to the Valerian story that does not appear in Eutropius or Zosimus. He was kept in a cage. The former emperor of Rome, the man in whose name the legions had marched, in whose honour temples had been dedicated and coins had been minted, and the formal administrative machinery of the world's greatest empire had turned every day for 7 years, was put on public display in an iron cage, shown to visitors, presented to Shapur's nobles, his generals, his clients, his allies, the delegations from the Indian subcontinent and the Central Asian steppes, and the Caucasian kingdoms who came to the court of the Sassanid King of Kings to pay their respects and assess the power of the man they were dealing with. And there, in a cage, was the answer to any question anyone might have had about how powerful Shapur I of Persia actually was. There was the Emperor of Rome. The Epitome states explicitly that Valerian was humiliated for the Sassanid Emperor's pleasure. The captivity was not merely a matter of confinement, it was a performance, a ritual, a continuous daily demonstration of Persian supremacy over the civilization that had for centuries dominated the Western world. Every visitor who saw the caged emperor went home with a story. Every king who heard the story recalibrated their assessment of where power truly lay in the known world. Whether every detail of the Epitome's account is strictly accurate is impossible to verify at this distance in time, but the psychological and political logic of it is impeccable. From Shapur's perspective, keeping Valerian alive and visibly humiliated served his interests far better than killing him, A dead emperor could be mourned, eulogized, and eventually transformed by Roman propaganda into a martyred hero. A living, caged, degraded emperor was undeniable. He was a fact. He was there, in the flesh, answering every question about Roman power with his mere continued existence, in captivity. Now we come to the account that has burned itself deepest into historical memory, the one that, when people speak of Valerian's captivity, they are most likely to be describing, the account of Lactantius, Lucius Caecilius Firmianus. Lactantius was a Latin Christian author and advisor to the Emperor Constantine I, the first Christian emperor of Rome. He wrote his work De Mortibus Persecutorum, on the deaths of the persecutors, around 315 AD, roughly 55 years after the events at Edessa. His purpose was explicitly theological and polemical, to demonstrate that every emperor who had persecuted Christians had been punished by God in ways proportionate to their crimes. Valerian, who had launched the most systematic persecution of the Christian Church since the reign of Decius, was a prime exhibit in Lactantius's argument. His account of Valerian's fate is the most detailed and the most gruesome in all of ancient literature on the subject. Lactantius states that Valerian was subjected to the greatest insults and humiliations by his captors throughout his captivity. Specifically, he describes Shapur using the former emperor of Rome as a human footstool, or more precisely, a human mounting block. Every time Shapur wished to mount his horse, an act the King of Kings would have performed multiple times every single day, he would summon Valerian. The old man would drop to his hands and knees on the ground, and Shapur would place his foot between the emperor's shoulder blades as he swung into the saddle. Every day, for years, the emperor of Rome on his hands and knees in the Persian dust, serving as the mounting step for the man who had destroyed his army and taken his empire's dignity. Lactantius continues, with no hope of release, Valerian eventually died in captivity, and what happened after death was, if possible, even more horrifying than what had preceded it. According to Lactantius, after Valerian died, Shapur ordered his body skinned. The flesh was stripped from the bones, and the skin, the actual outer surface of the Emperor of Rome, still recognizable as the husk of a man who had once commanded the world, was dyed with vermilion pigment, dyed the deep imperial purple red, and stuffed with straw. This grotesque trophy was then placed, displayed, in the main Zoroastrian fire temple at the heart of the Sassanid Empire, where it remained for years, a permanent sacrilege-drenched monument to Persian supremacy over the Roman world. Visitors came to see it. Kings and generals and priests and merchants stood before it, the stuffed, discoloured skin of the last undivided emperor of Rome, and understood. Lactantius records the exact words he attributes to Persian sources, that Valerian's skin was flayed, and his skin, stripped from the flesh, was dyed with vermilion, and placed in the temple of the gods of the barbarians. It was further alleged in some versions of the story that the skin was only given proper cremation and burial after a subsequent Roman victory over Persia, that some Roman general in a later campaign demanded the relic's release as a condition of peace terms. Now we must do what the best historians do. We must interrogate these accounts. Lactantius is a powerful writer, and his account is the most dramatic. It is also the most suspect, not because he was lying necessarily, but because his agenda was explicitly theological. He was writing a work designed to prove divine punishment for those who persecuted Christians. Valerian had persecuted Christians ferociously. Therefore, in Lactantius's framework, Valerian had to have suffered in ways proportionate to his crimes. The more grotesque and degrading the suffering, the more powerfully his theological argument was served. The footstool detail, the flaying, the stuffed skin in the temple. These are exactly the kind of details a polemical writer building a theological case would either select from available, tradition, or amplify from rumour, precisely because they are so morally satisfying and so memorably horrifying. The Persian evidence is, on this specific question, largely silent. Shapur's inscriptions at Kaaba-ye-Zartosht and Naqsh-e record his victories, his titles, his genealogy, and his military campaigns with evident pride and evident accuracy on the major facts. They do not describe what happened to Valerian after his capture. This is not evidence that the humiliations did not occur. Kings carving victory monuments do not typically include administrative details of what was done with their captives. But the silence is notable. Even more notable is how the rock reliefs actually depict Valerian. 6 kilometers northwest of Persepolis, in the Fars province of modern Iran, the sacred cliff face of Naqsh-e rises from the desert plain like a wall of history. Into its rock face, the Achaemenid Persian kings had carved their tombs, Darius the Great, Xerxes, Artaxerxes. It was the most sacred royal burial site in Persian civilization, the place where the greatest kings of the ancient world rested. Below those Achaemenid tombs, the Sassanid kings carved their own monuments, not tombs, victories. Massive rock reliefs, each one a frozen proclamation of Sassanid power, reaching up to 11 meters in length and 5 meters in height, carved into the living rock for all time. The most important of all the Naqsh-e reliefs is Shapur I's victory monument. It depicts, with extraordinary detail and precision, the confrontation between the Sassanid King of Kings and the 3 Roman emperors he defeated in his campaigns. The scene is as follows, based on the detailed scholarly analysis established in a landmark 1954 study by B.C. McDermott, which corrected earlier misidentifications and established the identification that modern scholarship overwhelmingly accepts. Shapur I sits on his horse at the centre. He is depicted in full royal regalia. Long flowing hair, curled and ringed beard, looped necklace, earrings, tight pleated tunic, cloak billowing dramatically behind him, his crenellated crown topped with a large royal globe. His long sword remains sheathed at his side, his left hand resting on its hilt, his right hand extended forward. He is composed, regal, absolutely in control. Beneath his horse, prostrate under the hooves, the most utterly defeated position possible, lies a youthful Roman emperor. This is Gordian III, crushed at Mesech in 244 AD. Under the horse, in the dust, trampled. Kneeling before the horse, both hands extended in supplication, left knee on the ground and a right knee bent, is a bearded middle-aged Roman in an imperial toga. His hands reach toward Shapur. This figure, identified by the short curly beard matching Philip's coinage, is Philip the Arab, the emperor who paid 500,000 gold denarii for the privilege of going home, and standing beside the horse, upright, wrist grasped by Shapur's extended right hand, is a beardless man in an imperial toga and laurel wreath, clean-shaven, thick-necked, wearing the sword and toga of an emperor. This is Valerian, identified by his coinage, which shows him beardless, and by his notably thick neck, which matches the standing figure exactly. And this is where the story becomes profoundly interesting. Valerian is not prostrate. He is not kneeling. He is not in chains or rags. He is standing, upright, in full imperial regalia, his wrist held by the King of Kings. The Persian monument, Shapur's own monument, carved to celebrate his greatest victories, designed to proclaim his power for eternity, does not show a degraded, caged, or brutalized emperor. It shows a captured man, yes, absolutely subdued. His wrist in the hand of the conqueror is unmistakable submission, but he is shown with his dignity intact. He is shown as what he was, an emperor taken, not a slave, not an animal, an emperor held. This is consistent with how Sassanid royal ideology understood the treatment of captured kings. To the Sassanid royal tradition, the captured king was a trophy, but a trophy of a specific kind. He was proof that the gods, Ahura Mazda, the Zoroastrian supreme deity, had favoured Shapur over his enemies. His continued existence in recognizable imperial form was itself the point. A caged, degraded, destroyed emperor proved less than a captured, recognizable, visibly subdued one. The Persian message was not, we destroyed Rome's emperor. It was, Rome's emperor is in our hands. We hold him. Rome, acknowledge this. Several modern scholars, drawing on the Persian reliefs, note explicitly that all representations of the captive Valerian show him unfettered and in regalia, which they argue disproves the rumours that he was mistreated, though this overstates the case somewhat since the reliefs are official royal monuments subject to their own propagandistic conventions. What emerges from the most careful reading of all the sources together is this. Valerian was almost certainly held in genuine, humiliating captivity. He was not treated as an honoured royal prisoner in the European tradition. He was not accommodated with the dignity his former station might have demanded. He suffered. His captivity was degrading, his attempts to buy his freedom were refused, and he died in Persian custody. The broad outlines of what Eutropius and Zosimus describe are almost certainly true. Whether he was specifically used as a footstool, whether his skin was literally flayed and stuffed and displayed in a temple, these specific details cannot be confirmed by any source other than Lactantius, a man with overwhelming theological motivation to make the story as terrible as possible. They are not confirmed by the Persian evidence. They are not confirmed by any contemporaneous source. They exist in the realm of historical legend. Stories that might be true might be amplified from a kernel of truth, or might be wholly invented by writers who needed Valerian's suffering to be commensurate with what they believed his crimes deserved. History is honest about this uncertainty, and the honest answer is, we do not know exactly what Valerian's captivity was like. We know it was real. We know it was degrading. We know it ended in death in Persia. And we know that the legend of the footstool and the stuffed skin has more power than almost any other story in the history of Rome, not because it is necessarily true, but because it captures something true about what Edessa meant. The legend of Valerian's skin in the temple is not merely a gruesome story. It is a story about what happens when an empire loses the thing that holds it together, the myth of its own invincibility. For 700 years, from the founding of the Republic to the reign of Valerian, Rome had built itself on a story. The story was this: we are the chosen of the gods, the inheritors of a divine mandate to rule the world, the civilization against which all others are measured. Our emperors are not merely men. They are the living embodiment of that mandate. They cannot be truly defeated. They cannot be truly humiliated. Even in defeat, Rome endures. Even in setbacks, Rome returns. Even in darkness, Rome is eternal. The skin of Valerian, if it was real, was the physical refutation of that story. It was the story of Rome turned inside out, literally. The purple, which had clothed the divine mandate, now dyed the stuffed husk of the man who had worn it. The eternal emperor, reduced to a leather trophy in a foreign temple. The civilization that called itself eternal, its highest symbol a decorated scarecrow in a Zoroastrian fire temple. Whether or not the skin was real, the legend was necessary. It was necessary because Rome needed a story as large as the catastrophe. A simple defeat in the field was not enough to contain the meaning of what happened at Edessa. The Gallic Empire under Postumus broke away almost immediately. The Palmyrene realm, which would not fully rupture from Rome until Zenobia's conquests of the early 200s and 70s, had its roots in the very power vacuum Edessa created. The myth of divine favour evaporated. Every province that had been held in Roman order by the belief in Roman invincibility now had to confront the evidence of Roman vulnerability. Something had to carry the weight of that rupture. The stuffed skin of a purple emperor in a Persian temple was, mythologically, exactly the right size. Shapur I returned to Persia a conqueror without parallel in Sassanid history, and he ensured that history would remember. He did not content himself with inscriptions. He carved his victory into the sacred rock of Iran in multiple locations. At Naqsh-e directly below the tombs of Darius and Xerxes, his Achaemenid predecessors, the men whose empire he was consciously restoring. At Bishapur, the great city he built in Fars, to celebrate his victories, where another relief depicts the triumphal scene. At Naqsh-e where the inscriptions of his titles and genealogy in 3 languages, Middle Persian, Parthian and Greek, permanently establish the record. At the Kaaba-i Zartosht, the mysterious tower at Naqsh-e where Shapur's massive inscription, the Res Geste Divi Saporis, explicitly modelled on the Roman tradition of imperial commemorative inscriptions, the tradition of Augustus himself, records in 3 languages the full account of his campaigns, his victories, and his capture of Valerian with his own hands. The relief at Naqsh-e measures approximately 11 metres in length and 5 metres in height. It is carved directly into the cliff beneath the tomb of Darius the Great, one of the most powerful and deliberate acts of political iconography in the ancient world. Shapur is placing his victory alongside the greatest victory of Persian history. He is declaring, Himself the heir and surpasser of the Achaemenid kings, he has done what Darius and Xerxes could not. He has not merely defeated Rome in battle, he has captured its emperor with his own hands. The inscription beneath the horse at Naqsh-e is damaged but readable, its content confirmed by the Kabbalah text. It includes Shapur's full titulature, his divine genealogy, and the statement of his victories over 3 Roman emperors. It is a document of absolute, uncompromising Persian supremacy, addressed to everyone who would ever visit this sacred site, which included every king, noble, priest and general of the Sassanid Empire for the next 4 centuries. It still stands today. Naqsh-e is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The face of Shapur I on horseback, his right hand grasping the wrist of the beardless man identified as Valerian, is as clear as it was in 260 AD. 2,000 years of wind, rain and time have not erased it. Rome's humiliation, carved in stone, is permanent. Valerian died in Persian captivity, date unknown, sometime in the 260s AD, probably before 265. His son Gallienus, who had been ruling the West as co-emperor since 253, made no attempt to rescue him. Whether this was because rescue was genuinely impossible, which it probably was, given the military chaos of the West, or because Gallienus had already politically calculated that his father's restoration would complicate rather than enhance his own position, is a question historians have debated. The Historia Augusta, a notoriously unreliable but endlessly fascinating source, makes dark suggestions about Gallienus's indifference to his father's fate. Whether those suggestions are fair we cannot determine with certainty. What we can determine is the world that Valerian's capture left behind. The Roman Empire that emerged from the decade following Edessa was permanently, fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. The central political reality that a single man wearing the imperial purple commanded by divine mandate the loyalty of all Rome's armies and all Rome's provinces was shattered and never fully restored. The Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east under the extraordinary Queen Zenobia, and the Gallienus-controlled Central Empire divided the Roman world for over a decade. Even after Aurelian reunited the empire in the 270s AD, the fracture lines remained, the scars visible in the new political realities of the late empire. The Christian community drew its own lesson from Valerian's fate. The persecutor had been punished. Constantine I himself, decades later, wrote to the Sassanid king Shapur II, citing Valerian's fate as evidence of divine punishment for anti-Christian persecution. The capture of Valerian, the last Roman emperor to systematically persecute the Church before Constantine's conversion, became a founding story of the Christian Roman Empire, an example of providential history in action. And in Persia, Shapur I continued to reign until 270 AD. 30 years as King of Kings, 10 years after his greatest triumph, his empire secure, his treasury filled with Roman gold, his cities populated by the deported craftsmen of the Roman East, his rock faces carved with eternal proclamations of Persian supremacy. He died of natural causes, in his own bed, in his own palace, in his own empire. In the end, perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Battle of Edessa and the capture of Valerian is not the battle tactics or the plague casualties, or even the legends of the footstool and the stuffed skin. The most important thing is what the Naqsh-e relief tells us about how Shapur I understood what he had done. He had not merely won a battle, he had not merely captured an emperor. He had placed himself in stone, alongside the tombs of Darius and Xerxes, the kings who had built the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. He had declared, in the most permanent medium available to a king of his era, that the story of Persian greatness was not over. That the humiliation of Persepolis, burned by Alexander the Great 5 centuries before him, had been answered. That the Achaemenid vision of a world-spanning Persian empire had found its heir. He carved it in rock. It is still there. The plain outside Edessa is quiet now. The armies are gone. The legions are gone. Dead. Captured. Marched east as prisoners into a Persian empire that put them to work, building cities in Khuzestan, constructing bridges and roads and monuments in the ancient heartland of Persia. Their Roman engineering skills turned to Persian glory. The dust has settled. The sun still beats down on that flat open ground between Kari and Edessa, unchanged since the day the ironclad horsemen of Shapur I closed the ring around the most powerful army Rome had assembled in a generation. What happened there in 260 AD did not destroy the Roman Empire. Rome survived. It always survived. Aurelian reunited the shattered pieces in the 200s and 70s. Diocletian reformed the military and the administration in the 280s and 290s. Constantine converted to Christianity in the early 300s and moved the capital to Constantinople. The eastern half of the empire endured for nearly 1,200 more years, until the fall of Constantinople in 1453. History is long and complicated, and a single battle, even one as catastrophic as Edessa, is never the simple, clean ending that dramatic narrative demands. But Edessa changed everything about what Rome was. Before Edessa, Rome could tell itself the story of invincibility, could believe with the deep bone-level certainty of 7 centuries of unbroken self-mythology, that the gods had chosen this people for eternal dominion, that the emperor was the living embodiment of divine mandate, that the purple was sacred and the eagles were eternal. After Edessa, that story required maintenance. It required effort. It required enforcement. It was no longer self-evident. The world had seen the emperor of Rome in Persian captivity, his dignity stripped before every king and border chief in the known world, and the world had not ended. The gods had not intervened. The eagles had not swooped down and plucked him from Shapur's grip. Rome was mortal. Its emperor could fall. Its armies could be destroyed. Its myth could be broken. Shapur I knew this. He carved it in rock so that no one would ever forget, and 1,500 years later, when Western historians began the great project of understanding why the Roman Empire fell, when Gibbon published his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 1776, when generations of scholars debated the causes and the timeline and the meaning of Rome's end, they kept coming back to the crisis of the 3rd century, to the decades between 235 and 284 AD, to the moment when the fractures first became catastrophic and the myth first cracked wide open. They kept coming back to Edessa. Because Edessa is where the story of eternal Rome first met the story of a world that would not accept Roman eternity. Where the unstoppable machine of Roman military power met a force that had studied it, understood it, prepared for it, and built something specifically designed to destroy it. Where the plague and the civil war, and the economic collapse and the loss of Roman strategic coherence all converged on one flat, hot, dusty plain and produced the single most consequential military defeat in Roman imperial history. The Emperor of Rome, taken alive by the King of Kings, his skin, perhaps, dyed purple and stuffed with straw in a Persian temple, his image carved forever into the sacred rock of Iran, his wrist in the hand of the conqueror, his empire broken behind him. Shapur I is still on that rock face, still on his horse, still holding the wrist of the man who thought Rome was eternal, telling us, in stone, that nothing is. That is the story of the Battle of Edessa, the Persian king who captured Rome's emperor alive. If this video moved you, challenged you, or taught you something you did not know, hit the like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it means the world to this channel. Subscribe if you have not already. We release in-depth, fully researched documentaries on history's greatest and most brutal conflicts, and every subscriber makes the next one possible. And drop a comment. What do you think was the most consequential moment in this entire story? The plague? The encirclement? The capture itself? The rock relief at Naqsh-e Rostam? I want to know what hit you hardest. And if you want to go deeper, watch our video on the Battle of Kari, where 3 centuries before Edessa, the Parthians gave Rome its first great catastrophe in the east. The link is on screen right now. History is waiting. I will see you in the next one.